The entire premise of woke neo-Marxism, this notion that society in classical Marxist fashion can basically be boiled down to this false dichotomy. In the wokerati's case, that dichotomy ends up being oppressed versus oppressors. Basically, white people, Christians, Jews, Asians end up being quote-unquote oppressors. That's news, frankly, to anyone who has ever read Jewish history, that the Jewish people could ever be oppressors. That's not typically how it's gone in human history. But all of this, where you are getting into to this arbitrary dividing of humanity into these classes based on something like skin color or religion, you're rejecting the Bible, because I argue in the book, Tyler, Israel and Civilization, that the single overarching ethical imperative for all of Western civilization is Genesis 1:27, one of the first verses in the entire Bible, where it says, God made man in his image, male and female he created them.
This is Tyler O'Neill, a senior editor at the Daily Signal. I'm honored to be joined by Josh Hammer, who is the senior editor at large at Newsweek, host of, is it The Josh Hammer Show and America on Trial, and also author of the new book, Israel and Civilization. Josh, it's so great to have you with us.
Tyler, I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
So I'd just like to dive right in. Israel is pivotal to the history of the West, from, the foundations of Judaism and Christianity to the battles that it's facing now. But I think what is new, you have a new message in this book. It's not just talking about history, it's also facing the threats that the West has. What do you think is the new strong message from your book?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to say how this book is different, Tyler, is that this is not a typical quote unquote pro-Israel book. I mean, anyone who has seen the cover, I have this painting of Moses parting the Red Sea with the Israelites there. We deliberately did not choose kind of your typical blue and white Star of David iconography, because this isn't a book that's even necessarily first and foremost about the current state of Israel or about U.S.-Israel relations or anything like that. That's all in there. I have multiple chapters on that, to be clear, and I give my very strong, unvarnished opinion on all those topics. So if you are very interested in that, then of course you too will be interested in Israel and civilization. But fundamentally, Tyler, this is a book that is written in the context of the post-October 7th milieu. I really wrote this not just in response to the horrific day of October 7th, 2023, but really in response to just the eruption, the eruption of not just Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, although that is obviously part of it, but just the increasingly just bubbling to the surface of outright anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism. So to give you an example, this miscreant at Columbia University, Mahmoud Khalil, was very involved with a group called CUAD, Columbia University Apartheid Divest. They literally have put up social media posts calling for the eradication of Western civilization there. And I've seen all this, and I said, okay, you know what? It's time for someone to actually write the case that defends not just the Jewish people and the Jewish state, but defends our broader and Western civilizational inheritance, ultimately going back to the Bible. Because, Tyler, that's really what I do in this book, is I basically argue that if you want to defend Western civilization, people say Western civilization is at a crossroads, we're at an inflection point. I agree with that. I am not downplaying that premise whatsoever. I totally agree with that there, and I identify at least 3 separate forces that seek to subjugate us and destroy us, namely in no particular order: wokeism, Islamism, and what I call global neoliberalism. Basically, John Lennon's Imagine playing out on a global stage. That's World Economic Forum, United Nations, basically the homogenizing imperative attempting to stamp out all of our differences. So I agree that we have to turn back the tide against these people there. But the question then, as a lawyer, I like to define terms. So, okay, we're saying Western civilization is at a crossroads. What is Western civilization? Funny you should ask. I have an answer. I argue in the book that Western civilization is largely synonymous with the Bible, with the Judeo-Christian tradition going back at least as far as God's revelation initially of his word to Moses and the Israelites standing there at Mount Sinai. And I have an extended argument that so much of what we take for granted today when it comes to basic day-to-day interactions, human interactions, when it comes to morality, ethics, law, politics, constitutional structure, so much of it ultimately gets back really to the Hebrew scripture. Let's take something as prosaic as the golden rule: treat others as we would like to be treated. Well, Tyler, I actually went to public school growing up. I only became religious over the past, X years or so. When I was in kindergarten and public school, I wasn't taught that the golden rule had any biblical origins there. Turns out it actually does. It's right there in Leviticus chapter 19. You shall treat the stranger as your fellow. That's the golden rule, basically, in practice there. And the book of Leviticus, by the way, was well understood by the American founders. Look at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. What is inscribed on the outside of the Liberty Bell? It's not a quote from Cicero or Aristotle. It's a quote from the Bible, from the book of Leviticus. You shall proclaim liberty unto the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin famously wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea. Abraham Lincoln famously spoke of Americans as an almost chosen people, using this covenantal language that he clearly learned from the Hebrew Bible. So if you want to stand for something, if you want to actually turn back the tide against wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism, it is imperative that we be confident in who we are, because only when we are confident in our inheritance can we possibly project that strength and ultimately launch a successful civilizational counteroffensive. So the book, Tyler, is frankly nothing less than an audacious and ambitious call for Jews and Christians alike to link arms and stand shoulder to shoulder like never before, and to engage in the work of a joint ecumenical biblical restoration. Because without remembering and recovering that sense of who we are and what we stand for, we're not going to have any idea of where we're going, and we will ultimately then be unsuccessful in turning back the enemies that Jews and Christians alike both share.
Well, I love that answer. I also think, from your own experience leading Jews Against Soros, talking about two of those, and actually really involvement with all three of those major threats. Would you highlight, and you probably discuss in the book, the forces behind these threats that Western civilization is facing? I mean, I think of not just George Soros, he's largely handed the reins over to his son, Alex, but you also have people like Arabella Advisors. You have these big donors that are pushing this narrative. And of course, I think there is also a grassroots element of it. Not to say that those on the left, nobody actually believes this stuff. Some of them really do. It's not just money. But how do you define, you mentioned those three, radical Islam or Islamism, globalism, and Marxist neoliberalism?
Yeah, so it's very similar. I mean, in my taxonomy, it's wokeism, Islamism, global neoliberalism, but basically the same thing there. I mean, none of these are necessarily more existential than the other. They are all existential in their own various ways there. Look, the entire premise of woke neo-Marxism, this notion that society in classical Marxist fashion can basically be boiled down to this false dichotomy. In the wokerati's case, that dichotomy ends up being oppressed versus oppressors. And we've seen how this plays out in practice. Basically, white people, Christians, Jews, Asians end up being quote-unquote oppressors. That's news, frankly, to anyone who has ever read Jewish history, that the Jewish people could ever be oppressors. That's not typically how it's gone in human history, but neither here nor there for present purposes there. But all of this, where you are getting into this arbitrary dividing of humanity into these classes based on something like skin color or religion there, You're rejecting the Bible, because I argue in the book, Tyler, Israel and Civilization, that the single overarching ethical imperative for all of Western civilization is Genesis 1:27, one of the first verses in the entire Bible, where it says, God made man in his image, male and female he created them. Now, as a student of American history, I've long kind of pondered whether or not in my heart of hearts I can actually bring myself to agree with Thomas Jefferson's famous line in the Declaration that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And the reason I struggle with that is because I've asked sometimes of myself, would a Taliban goat herder in the mountains of Afghanistan truly actually find it self-evident as it applies to Afghanistan that all men are created equal? I'm not so sure that if I'm being intellectually honest, I can answer that question yes. But here's what I can say, that the reason that men like Thomas Jefferson, like John Locke writing a century prior and in England in his second treatise, the reason that these Enlightenment liberals were actually able to confidently say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, is because they were writing in a certain tradition, in a certain milieu that they, like so many today, perhaps took a little bit for granted. Maybe not Locke. Locke actually was a religious Christian himself. But the point is that they were writing in a context where biblical truths such as Genesis 1:27, we're kind of just running through the entire body politic there. And this is kind of the extended argument of the book, is like you cannot take this for granted. It's important to recover this, to understand where it comes from, because only once we understand where it comes from can we have the spine and the confidence to turn back the tide there. On the global neoliberalism front, this is kind of where the state of Israel ties in a little bit as well here. The state of Israel is basically the canary in the coal mine for the globalists, the same way that the Jewish people are the canary in the coal mine for the DEI, the cultural Marxists, obviously the Islamists as well. We saw that on October 7th, and we've seen it time and time again as well. But the reason that the global neoliberals go after the state of Israel in transnational fora like the United Nations, and to be clear, they ultimately want nothing less than the eradication of the nation state itself. People like Soros, Open Society, Arabella, Tides Foundation, as you mentioned there. The reason that they start with the actual capital S state of Israel, well, there are multiple reasons for this. Perhaps most obviously, the current state of Israel is just a very nationalist enterprise. Anyone who's ever met an Israeli knows that they probably love flying their flag. There's all sorts of national flags. They have virtually no illegal immigration. They patrol their borders extraordinarily closely. There's mandatory conscription in the military. Basically, all the metrics that you can be a nationalist country, they fulfill that. But the deeper and really kind of to their credit, like their intellectually honest, albeit diabolical reason for focusing so much on the state of Israel, I argue, is because Israel is actually the world's first nation state. I mean, going back to ancient times, when King David unites the tribes of Israel, well, first in Hebron and then ultimately in Jerusalem, that's really the first act of uniting tribes into what we might call a nation state. By the way, biblical Israel had no extraterritorial ambitions beyond its defined borders, because the borders were literally defined by God Almighty himself there. We might call that the ancient predecessor to the modern Westphalian post-1648 nation state. Interestingly, actually, in antiquity, you might even contrast the biblical nation-state model for global affairs. You might contrast that with the Roman Empire. That was actually the predecessor to the imperial model. So one of the things that I say in the book is that if you care about the nation-state today, which you should, I am an American patriot, I'm a nationalist, I care a lot about the nation-state, I've been very active in national conservatism for years now. If you care about the nation-state and you oppose the globalizing, homogenizing imperative, but I think that you should understand that the state of Israel is the nationalist canary in the globalist coal mine, the same way that the Jewish people for thousands and thousands of years have been the canary in the coal mine when it comes to a broader civilizational decay and broader civilizational rot. In that case, they come for the Saturday people first, then the Sunday people next. That's the way it's been forever, basically as long as humans have lived on God's green earth. In current times where you have this metastasizing globalist imperative from people like Soros, Tides Foundation, the United Nations, Klaus Schwab, and so forth there, they are choosing to start with the capital S state of Israel for basically the exact same reason. It actually makes a lot of sense, albeit it's frankly just evil.
Yeah, I mean, I like to delve into some of your historical claims here, because I just went to Egypt last summer, and seeing, the Marmara Palette, the uniting of North and South Egypt into one country, and then of course, Babylon and other places. You can talk about the imperial model versus the uniting tribes model. I really like there's an inherent appeal of going to the Bible, but how do you deal with some of these other historical? And I also think, and this is maybe getting into too many theological debates, but, as a Christian, I know that there were multiple strands of Judaism in the first century. There are still different strands of Judaism today, although the ones that existed in the first century are largely transformed today. But, the notion of expanding the circle, you had the God-fearers, even in first century Judaism, where some foreigners were welcomed into, to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But you still had this division such that even in early Christian circles, it was a big move when Jesus, was able to say to the woman, even the dogs eat the table scraps from the children. And this slowly incorporating people from other backgrounds. And you see it throughout Judean Israeli history with some of the people in Jesus's line. So, I mean, but how does the synthesis work in your view? You talk about the Judeo-Christian inheritance, rooting things in the Bible. I love that. The Bible is pretty complicated, though. It's essentially a library of 66 different books. Where is the bedrock that you build everything on.
Yeah, but there are certain themes that emerge. I mean, this is kind of what I say when I get asked this question, Tyler, is that there are certain overarching themes that emerge. So, for instance, I have an entire chapter 3 of the book, on the philosophy of the Hebrew Bible, frankly, on the philosophy actually of just Jewish law itself, which we refer to as halacha. And one of the things that I talk about time and time again in chapter 3, especially since 2016, since Donald Trump came down the gilded escalator and won the election, I think a lot of people on the right today are asking questions like, what does it mean to be a conservative? Maybe we had this kind of more classically liberal inspired brand of conservatism, of Frank Meyer's fusionism, this notion that individualism was to be exalted over any notion of community and the common good. In reality, these are ancient questions that go back to the origins of men having political and legal thoughts there. So I talk actually in that very chapter 3, a lot about reconciling individualism, and to be clear, individual moral dignity, individual self-worth. It is all rooted, as I said earlier, in Genesis 1:27. Our Catholic friends would call it Imago Dei. For Jews, we would say B'Tselem Elohim. That man is made in God's image there. That is the overall foundation of genuine human moral worth there. And really, it is that which must be defended today against the likes of the DEI and woke crowd who are seeking to effectively eradicate that in favor of a modern day caste system. On the other hand, biblical thought has always been concerned deeply with the idea of the common good and the community and the notion of a nation. So to give one very concrete example, Exodus chapter 19, when God is standing there with Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, he famously says, in this kind of world-altering quid pro quo of sorts, if you accept my covenant, then you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He's not saying each and every one of you shall be holy. He's getting at a theme here of national holiness, of collective holiness there. I even cite the Talmud, actually, in this book. The Talmud, which gets so utterly, completely bastardized by so many anti-Semites day in and day out. It's simply just a codification of the oral Torah. It's really nothing more than that. As someone who's been studying Talmud for years now, I can tell you most of it is actually very dry legal material. But there occasionally are some very, very interesting passages. And one of the passages that I quote in the book comes from the tractate called Shabbat, which is the tractate about the Jewish Sabbath. And there's this very, very interesting exchange here that really kind of is a searing rebuke of John Stuart Mill live and live style harm theory liberalism. And in this Talmudic tractate, it basically says that if you are in a community and you have the opportunity to correct a moral sin of the community before it metastasizes any greater than that, then the weight of the community falls on you. That then you are ultimately to blame for the sins of the entire community. Similarly, on a global level, he who is so powerful that he has the opportunity to nip in the bud some sort of sin that could engulf the entire world, if you fail to act in that moment there, then ultimately all the sins of the world come back to you. That's a very different conception of how to balance individualism with the common good than we see in all sorts of Enlightenment and liberal thought here. So all this really kind of does get back to the Hebrew scriptures. That would just be kind of one example. Now, I think your point about ancient Egypt is very interesting, by the way. I have to confess that you're the first deeply knowledgeable interviewer who's ever asked me this question. I've been to Egypt. I actually was there a little over 2 years ago. I saw the pyramids there. It was kind of a lifelong dream. I was very happy I did it. Cairo, not the world's cleanest city, but it was
No. Oh gosh,
very
it's
far
so
from
packed.
it, in fact.
Yeah.
But it was very cool to be there. So here's what I would say to that. So yes, there was this very interesting uniting of the kingdoms there, but there was nothing compelling about ancient Egypt that necessarily would have precluded it from territorially expanding into what today we might call Libya or Sudan or Ethiopia. They didn't necessarily have defined borders. It was the uniting of separate kingdoms there, but there was not this kind of deep set notion that we are set in our borders. We are content with it. We are humble there. The reason that I cited to King David's uniting the tribes is because their borders were very set, and they were literally very set going all the way back to the book of Genesis there, because it ultimately comes from the divine source itself there. So if you're looking for some sort of parallel from antiquity to the modern kind of international Westphalian nation-state system there, I'm not saying that international lawyers are in any way the equivalent of God Almighty setting those boundaries. Very, very, very far from it there. But it seems to me like like the more obvious parallel would be the Bible as opposed to Mesopotamia or Egypt or so forth.
No, I really like that answer. I'd like to get into, you talk about civilizational threats, and why, what we're seeing in America right now. We have this very big battle between President Trump and Judge Boasberg. Interesting juxtaposition there. But we have one after another of these leftist organizations that are filing these lawsuits, essentially engaging in judge shopping, finding the right venue where likely the judge is going to issue an order that's going to crack down on the administration, moving in a direction that is protecting America from threats, both internal and external in some cases. In this case, they're talking about deporting alleged members of Tren de Aragua. I'd like to hear, your book is delving into the civilizational threats of the West. How do you see those threats playing out concretely? And are we at, a defining moment when we see these judges making these rulings, holding Trump back? If Trump doesn't ultimately prevail in some of these cases, does that spell something really horrible for our civilizational path going forward?
So Tyler, let me begin slightly different, then I'll get back to that. So one thing that I've found super interesting over the past, call it, year and a half, 2 years, really, I guess 2 years now, ever since Alvin Bragg in New York City became the first prosecutor to actually indict a former president of the United States. We hear this refrain over and over again from the left: no one is above the law. No one is above the law, they shout there.
Right.
Well, first of all, as I also explained in one of the chapters of the book, chapter 4, where do you guys think this notion that no one is above the law, in this case, the king is not above the law, where do you think that comes from exactly? It literally comes from the book of Deuteronomy. I mean, that's actually exactly where it's from, this principle. In fact, John Fortescue, who was a 14th to 15th century English conservative, really kind of one of the godfathers, the forefathers of what today we would call the Anglo-American conservative tradition there. He actually literally cites Deuteronomy for this very proposition, that in this case, in the English legal system, even the monarch is not ultimately above the law there. So the liberals, who are quoting this pithy statement time and time again there, I'm not sure, frankly, that they understand where it is coming from. Frankly, if they understood where it is coming from, they actually might start saying it less, because the very last thing they want to do is actually favorably invoke scripture. So that kind of brings us then back to Judge Boasberg versus Donald Trump and kind of the separation of powers tiff that we are in here. Look, a lot of people are saying that Donald Trump is fomenting a constitutional crisis there with calling for impeachment, with this, with that. First of all, let me just say that the Constitution is a very durable structure. The Constitution did not cease to exist during the Civil War of all time periods. The Constitution has been with us for a very long time. It has survived some deeply tumultuous times in American history there. Thomas Jefferson famously said back of the nation's origins that the Constitution would essentially have to be torn up and rewritten every 20 years with the blood of patriots or some kind of very colorful expression like that. He was wrong, okay? I mean, he was very, very wrong about this because the Constitution has proven to be a lot more durable than Thomas Jefferson thought it was. So I'm really not worried about a so-called constitutional crisis. Frankly, to the extent that there is a constitutional crisis right now, it's not coming from the people who they think it's coming from. They're saying that the left, the media, they're saying that's coming from Donald Trump. Baloney. It's not coming from Donald Trump right now. There is a genuine separation of powers crisis at the moment. It is coming from these overweening district court judges who are trying to bring the entirety of the federal government to a halt. Frankly, Tyler, they tried to do this the first time around too. So by my math, during the first Trump administration, there were between 65 and 70 so-called nationwide injunctions. That's more than the first 44 presidents of the United States combined, for a very simple reason, which is that there was no such thing as a so-called nationwide injunction until the late 1960s. It was the Johnson or the Nixon presidency. And the reason in turn for that is because it's made up. There is no such thing as a legitimate exercise of the judicial power of which the Article 3 vesting clause speaks that allows you to actually bind everyone in the country. That's literally just not how it works. And one example historically that demonstrates how this actually works in practice as opposed to this judicial supremacist myth that we are currently living in, Abraham Lincoln, my favorite figure in American history there. He understood the myth of judicial supremacy like no one else, frankly, in American history. After the Dred Scott case came down in 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney, the most infamous ruling in American history, holds that black people were not or cannot be citizens. Lincoln says time and time again in his debates with Stephen Douglas, if I become a public servant, at that time he was running for senator, not president, but if I'm in a position of power to do so, I will respect this judgment as pertains to the parties to the suit, Mr. Scott, but beyond that, I'm not going to lift a finger to do that. And sure enough, when he was president, Abraham Lincoln issued passports to blacks in the Western territories of the U.S. in direct defiance, actually, of the Dred Scott case there. So this notion that judges going all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court have the ability to actually settle the law of the land for all of us there, that's just not our system of governance there. And at some point, SCOTUS is going to have to take up the question, ideally, as to whether or not these nationwide injunctions exceed the legitimate boundaries of the judicial power of Article 3. Hint, hint, wink, wink, they do. Alternatively, the way this really should work out in practice, although my hopes are not up, Congress could actually legislate the abolition of this tomorrow. Congress has plenary power, essentially, applying the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 to the judicial power of Article 3. They have plenary, full-scale sweeping power to define federal courts' remedies however they want to. So if they want to abolish this tomorrow, they easily could. Now, you'd have to attach it to one of these so-called must-pass piece of legislation and some sort of funding bill, whatever. Keep the government open. I guess good luck getting that past the infamous Senate parliamentarian and perhaps Majority Leader John Thune. But certainly there are any number of remedies that could be used here. What the president definitely does have, and I'll stop after this, what the president definitely does have is the legitimate power of the executive power of Article 2. So when people say no one is above the law, I agree with that. But what is the law? Let's actually start with what the executive power actually is.
Well, and I think that definition, because you mentioned the Constitution surviving for this extended period of time, which I very much agree. I'm a very big fan of the Constitution. But I have seen the growth of the administrative state and the way that this essentially fourth branch of government was created almost as, it's the perfect solution to Congress's bind, because Congress has all this authority and they have to answer to the voters. But Congress can shove that authority off onto these agencies, say, you make the rules that are too unpopular. The people say they want clean air. You, EPA, you make the rules. We're going to stand back. Then the people can blame the EPA. Congress gets credit for making the law and everything's hunky-dory. And then now we have this system where these agencies are considered independent of the president, even though he is, he has plenary power under Article 2, Section 1, to oversee the executive branch. So we've kind of been in, to some degree, a constitutional crisis, I would argue, since FDR, if not before that, because we have this new system that undermines Congress. And there was this lefty, and anyway, I'm interviewing you, not talking about myself here, but there was this lefty thing that condemned me for saying, oh, he thinks Congress should have the authority. He doesn't believe that anymore because of President Trump. And I'm like, no, actually, I still believe that. I just want the president to rule the executive branch and Congress to have the ultimate authority, which it arguably does. I mean, there are checks and balances. But do you think that, when you're talking about civilizational threats, is there a civilizational threat there to the Constitution where the system, this bureaucracy has effectively swallowed the founder's vision?
Well, let me say at the outset that we've talked a lot about the Bible, and there's a lot of Bible quoted in my book. The Bible is somewhat agnostic when it comes to regime structure. I mean, to the extent that it's favorably inclined towards anything, it's certainly more favorably inclined towards monarchy. But monarchy happens to be just the prevailing system of governance at that time. There's nothing inherently anti-biblical about a republican system of governance or anything like that. There, So I'm not sure that this gets to the core of biblical principles. When it comes to political philosophy, the Bible seems to me to stand more for certain kind of paradigms when it comes to reconciling individualism with the common good, as we were discussing there. It comes to certain substantive paradigms, such as individual moral self-worth, Genesis 1:27, the Ten Commandments, obviously, thou shalt not steal. So there is a political philosophy of the Bible, but it's not necessarily getting at the idea of regime structure. Having said that, as a lawyer, as someone who clerked in the Fifth Circuit, as someone who's published legal scholarship, and I actually have another piece forthcoming later this spring in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. I care a lot about the U.S. Constitution because I think it's a very good one. I think it's actually a very, very good Constitution. I think the Federalist Papers are beautiful. I happen to be a big fan of them. And I do worry when there are serious attempts to undermine the constitutional order. And I think your point that we've basically been living in one extended constitutional crisis going back at least as far as the FDR presidency, quite possibly, frankly, going back even further to the Woodrow Wilson presidency. Maybe actually even further than that. I mean, it was frankly kind of the statutory impetus for the modern administrative state were these civil service acts from the late 1800s, actually going back to the Gilded Age. So you arguably could go back even to like the Rutherford B. Hayes presidency and President Harrison in Cleveland. But the point is that it's been a very long time, and FDR definitely takes this to a whole nother level. Now, the independent agency point is a very astute one. There's potentially going to be a ripe opportunity for SCOTUS to rule here correctly. I thought the Hampton-Dellinger dispute was actually heading in that direction. He was the guy who was the special counsel of the Office of Special Counsel, and that is one of these so-called independent agencies there. There's a similar ongoing litigation at the National Labor Relations Board, another so-called independent agency involving the firing of a Democratic appointee. So we could see that taken up directly there. This gets back to your point to an FDR-era New Deal case called Humphrey's Executor from 1935. That was the first time that the court said that there can be such thing as a quote-unquote independent agency as long as it has the right mix, the right admixture of legislative, judicial, and executive functioning. It's all made up. It's all terrible. I mean, properly speaking, if there is an agency of the government and is not within Article 2, Article 1, or Article 3, then you're in no man's land. I mean, it literally has to exist in one of the three. So hopefully SCOTUS rules the right way on that if/when they get that case. I think they will. This court's typically pretty good when it comes to bread and butter structural constitutionalism questions. I get a little iffy when it comes to so-called culture war stuff, but on the very structural bread and butter stuff, I tend to be a little more confident there. So we are definitely in the throes, not just geopolitically and globally, of this kind of grand civilizational standoff between what I describe as the Judeo-Christian inheritance and wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. We've been in the midst of an internal divide over what our own republic looks like for a very, very, very long time now. And, one of the ironies, Tyler, and I think this is something that really even Trump's critics on the right really have to grapple with, is that for all the rhetoric that we hear about Donald Trump being a unique historical threat, he's a dictator, he's a fascist, he hates the Constitution, he's this, he's that there. Look at the actual lawsuits that are playing out now, the actual legal positions that his DOJ is taking basically day in and day out when it comes to restoring a proper conception of the judicial power, when it comes, frankly, even, I would argue, to birthright citizenship. I mean, on so many of these legal issues there, he is actually the one who is fighting day in and day out to restore the actual original meaning of the Constitution against those who seek to pervert it and distort it, and against those who have indeed perverted it and distorted it. Again, going back at least as far as FDR, arguably going back, frankly, to the Gilded Age.
So I want to kind of end where we begin, where, the first word of your title is Israel. I think I've been seeing some comparison. We have two big wars going on that Americans are focusing on right now. One of them is in Ukraine, and the other one is in Israel and its surrounding environments after the October 7th pogrom. Those who would compare the two, who say that these conflicts are similar, they're, waking us up to an era of great power conflict that we hadn't seen in a long time. I'd like to hear you respond to that, because I think that your response will be enlightening, because I don't think you agree that the issues are the same in these two conflicts.
I don't. Donald Trump certainly doesn't. He views them very differently, and I think he's correct to do so, actually. So look, Tyler, I have a whole chapter in the book, it's chapter 7, basically making the case for tight-knit U.S.-Israel relations on avowedly and explicitly foreign policy realist grounds, America first grounds, you might even call it there. It's funny, we hear a lot of people say that the Israel issue, U.S.-Israel relations, a lot of people say, oh, it's an old neocon issue. It's a Bush administration issue. Well, I think that's news to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is very much not a neoconservative. He is Mr. America First, Mr. MAGA. He's also the most pro-Israel president in American history for a very clear...
Who opened the embassy in Jerusalem.
He opened the embassy in Jerusalem. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He pulled out of UNRWA. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, it would take us hours, frankly, to kind of talk about all the minutia that he did to bolster this relationship. And frankly, what was the result of that bolstering of this relationship? The Abraham Accords. He showed actually that when you go all in for U.S.-Israel relations, when you embolden and empower Israel there, you actually make peace. The Middle East was quite quiet during those 4 years there. And part of this chapter, the book, chapter 7, that I talk about, Tyler, I talk about when Israel feels emboldened and empowered to act, they will act in a way virtually all the time. Again, no two countries will literally ever, we're talking here like 95+% time when it comes to kind of sharing the same interest there. No two countries will have 100% Venn diagram overlap. But to give you one very concrete example of how Israel will act when they feel emboldened or empowered to do so in a way that redounds to both of our interests there, I go to last summer. So last summer, Israel decided to kind of go on this Michael Corleone baptism scene-esque revenge killing spree against its enemies. And that killing spree ended in the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah in his bunker in Beirut. After that, they actually got Yahya Sinwar. So, I mean, pick your spot wherever you want to end it. But before they got Nasrallah in Beirut, they took out other high-ranking Hezbollah jihadis as well. Two of these were named Fuad Shakor and Ibrahim Akil. Now, unless you're deep in the weeds of radical Islamic jihadism, you probably don't know who these two men are. So let me tell you. So Fuad Shakor was the mastermind of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombings that slaughtered over 240 U.S. Marines there. Ibrahim Akil was the mastermind of the U.S. embassy bombing in Beirut that same year. 60 to 70 people were killed in that. The U.S. State Department has had $5 and $7 million bounties on those two men's head for over 4 decades, and nothing happened. They were alive for 4 decades. They were two of Nasrallah's top-ranking advisors within the Hezbollah organizational infrastructure. Israel took them out. So I hear this refrain from people, oh, what does the United States get from U.S.-Israel relations? Okay, well, you get a dead Fuad Shakor, you get a dead Ibrahim Akil, and if that weren't good enough, you get a dead Hassan Nasrallah and a dead Yahya Sinwar as well. But the Israel issue more generally, Tyler, playing out on the geopolitical stage, it's really just the geopolitical equivalent of the fate of Jews and Christians going back thousands of years. For thousands and thousands of years, anti-Semites have understood that you go after the Jews first. You attack the Saturday people first. You attack the people that are called to be a light unto the nations in the book of Isaiah, because your ultimate goal is the eradication of Christendom, of the Christians. Karl Marx is very explicit about this in his On the Jewish Question anti-Semitic essay. He hates the Jews, but his actual goal is overthrowing Western capitalism and Western Christendom. Ditto, likewise, on the transnational stage there. They're going after the state of Israel for all the reasons that we discussed when it comes to the nation state and so forth there. But really, they're really just picking on the group of people, again, that are the original people of the book, the light unto the nations there, because their actual goal, again, as these miscreants on these campuses make clear, is overthrowing Western civilization there. So that's part of it there. Finally, just real quick, the one thing I will add there, as a realist, I think that America has an overarching imperative this century to focus on China. I think that China is by far America's number one threat this century there. And I actually agree with the premise of redeploying American resources from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. I would probably even expedite that. The relevant question, though, is how do we secure our very real interests, such as, I don't know, freedom of sea, freedom of navigation on the Red Sea? How do we secure all these interests while allowing us to then redeploy these resources? The obvious answer, and Donald Trump gets this in his bones, is to embolden and empower your allies to patrol the region in a way that redounds to both of your interests there. This is a very sober, clear-headed, MAGA, America First realist case. I find it personally pretty compelling there, but I guess we'll see how people react to the book.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. Is there anything else we didn't get to that would be a good tease for the book that you want to mention? And where can people follow you?
Yeah, so the book is called Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Praise be to God. It reached a high of number 3 on all of Amazon last week. It was literally sold out on Amazon on publication day morning, but it's been restocked. So if you order it now, you should get it ASAP there. Clearly, there seems to be an appetite for this message, so I hope that you'll pick up your copy today, whether it's at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever you get your books. As for me personally, I'm on X, Josh_Hammer. I host 2 shows, The Josh Hammer Show and America on Trial with Josh Hammer. And Tyler, my friend, it's been great catching up with you.
Great to have you. Thanks again for joining us.
Subscribe to get the news the legacy media won't tell you and only the Daily Signal can bring to you.